Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 6, Ancient Rome. And we're going to get started by talking about the foundations of Rome, and we're going to kind of build our way up to talking about the Roman Republic and eventually the Roman Empire and its fall. So, we're going to start with the foundations of Rome. And one of the things that I want to kind of put in perspective is prior to about 1000 BCE, Italy really was the home to very, very few people. Uh, a lot of people thought of it as kind of a place that was a little backwards, inhabited by uncivilized tribes. And in comparison to other parts of the ancient world, like the great kingdoms of Egypt and Babylon, and maybe even the island of Crete, this wasn't considered to be maybe a civilized area as of yet. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the origin and a little bit about the origin story that it kind of comes from. So, the Alps, for the most part, are north of Rome, and they aided the growth of the Roman civilization and protected Rome without isolating it. And the story goes is that Rome was founded by a set of twins named Romulus and Remus. And supposedly these twins were raised by wolves, or for the most part, we might call them like feral kids in this day and age. But needless to say, they were raised by this wolf or she wolf, and they became mighty, mighty men as a result of that. Okay, chances are this is probably more fiction than fact, but it makes for a good story and maybe a nice origin story to kind of build up the self-esteem of our Romans. So some of the earliest people that kind of center around this area are a group of people known as the Etruscans. After about 1000 BCE, Italy was invaded by a number of tribes from the outside, and a lot of those tribes carried iron weapons, making it very easy for invaders to take control of some of the small villages and such. And these invaders are today known as the Etruscans. Okay, and the lands that they occupied eventually became known as Etruria, which is kind of the west coast of Italy. So, under the Etruscan rule, this was very good for the city of Rome because they built walls and sewers and they introduced new building techniques, they influenced culture and eventually learning. So, in a way, maybe this invasion was for the best. Number three, Rome became a republic after a region wide revolt against the Etruscan rule, which allowed for Roman aristocrats to establish a republic. And this kind of goes back about to the midpoint of the 600 BCEs, and this is basically about the time that this village became known as Rome and kind of had developed themselves. The king, for the most part, governed with the help of a council, which was known as the Senate, and members of the Senate were kind of the leading citizens of Rome. And technically, the word Senate comes from the Latin word senex, meaning old man. Okay. As a result of that, we started seeing a class division. And we had people who were known as rich patricians. These are people that were kind of the upper class that maintained their power by providing financial, social, or legal support for their client families in return for political backing and loyalty. Okay, it's our patricians who are going to be the ones who kind of get the notoriety for running the Etruscans out of this part of Europe. Okay, below them there will be another class that we'll talk about here in a moment. But taking a look at the map that we have here, the area that you see, this is Rome, and this area is sometimes known as the area of Latinum. The area that the Etruscans, for the most part, had was this area along the western coast of Italy. So, plebes or plebeians were our lower class. They consisted of smaller landowners, tenant farmers, that would be people who were, for the most part, working the land of other people. Their life changed after the year 494 BC when the plebeian council was formed. And at that point, plebeians began to regulate their own affairs. So, in a way, they were kind of getting a little more power. And part of that was the fact that if you were looking at the proportion of population, there were more people who were plebeians than there were patricians. Number 6, the forum, which, by the way, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner here, there's a photograph of the forum as it stands today. The forum influenced Roman government by providing a location for city leaders to encounter common citizens. In a way, it's kind of like Washington, D.C., if you ever go upon the mall or if you go up on Capitol Hill. It was an area where ordinary citizens could rub shoulders with their politicians and maybe get an opportunity to tell them what their feelings were about what was happening in government. Number 7, major events in Rome's expansion were the conquest of Italy, the Punic Wars, and the conquest of Greece. Greece by this period of time, had fallen into kind of a state of chaos. After the death of Alexander the Great, Greece was split into different parts, and over time, a series of not necessarily strong leaders led to this part of the world coming under the control of outside forces. And eventually, the Romans are going to be moving into this area and taking it over. In number 8, in ancient Rome, only property owners served in the military. This is due to the Roman belief that only those citizens who had some property to protect would actually fight bravely. In other words, if you had nothing at stake, you probably wouldn't fight very hard to protect the land that was there. Number 9, in the Roman military, a legion was a unit of the Roman army. A centurion was a non-commissioned officer who commanded a century, and a century was a group of about 100 men. This makeup of the Roman military is very similar to what we see in the makeup of the United States Army, as far as how we put men into companies, men and women into companies, and divide them into different fighting forces. Number 10, once the Romans conquered a people, the Romans did not interfere with their domestic affairs. That's like the affairs at home or their cultural affairs. This probably caused new subjects not to want to rebel against their Roman conquerors. And in a way, it allowed for the Romans to be able to govern over the land, but not necessarily to govern the hearts and the minds of these people, to allow them to still have a certain amount of say in the way that they live their lives. We're going to get into talking a little bit about the Punic Wars. And, some of this is to kind of understand a little bit about the geography of this part of the world. Italy is on the Italian peninsula, kind of in the southern part of the continent of Europe. And when we talk about the region of the Mediterranean, this was a region that for years had lots of trade. If you remember back to talking about the Phoenicians had set up a variety of colonies throughout the Mediterranean coast, and one of them happened to be Carthage. And if you take a look at the map below, you'll see that Carthage is kind of in the northern part of the continent of Africa, not very far from the Italian peninsula. And hence, we're going to have a series of war between Carthage and Rome, and we're going to get to talking about that. So, in number 11, Hannibal, who was a Carthaginian, meaning that he had been part of that old Phoenician Empire, he descended the Alps. Yes, he was going to attack Rome, and he did this with a force of war elephants, which was really probably a sight to be seen. Quite the spectacular, I would say. But this must have been shocking and frightening to the Romans, because most Romans had never seen an elephant or anything of that size before. So it would be kind of like maybe over 100 years ago when the first tanks were introduced into warfare. It was just something that was really beyond anybody's imagination to see something like that in combat. In number 12, the Roman defeat of Carthage was due in part to the building of the Roman navy. Scipio, who was able to tear down Hannibal and Carthage by transporting a strong army across the Mediterranean and to attack the supply routes and bases in Spain. And in the year 149 BCE, the city of Carthage was completely destroyed and its people had been enslaved. So, to kind of sum up the early Roman Republic, Romans, for the most part, wanted to prevent one person from gaining too much power. Romans set up a republic in the year 509 BCE. All government officials were patricians. Plebeians had little power. Eventually, the plebeians demand written laws, and plebeians win the right to choose their own officials, and plebeian officials have the right to veto laws that harm others. In a way, this is kind of the makeup of like the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate being kind of our patricians, and our House of Representatives kind of being our plebeians. But needless to say, in number 5, more than 2,000 years later, writers of the U.S. Constitution use Roman ideas to kind of help form our government. Thank you very much.